These videos are about regular people talking about the things that divide us, immigration, race, Trump, etc., so they might offend you. But I hope they're useful, like some videos I made about home repairs that help thousands of people. You see, I hate doing my own home repairs. I don't want to listen to a professional home repair guy who makes it look easy. TV pundits give me the same vibe. I don't want to listen to these people. When you see them on TV, they're at work. It's their job to talk about this stuff. They're not really interested in learning from each other and fixing the problem. They sure don't ask the questions I would ask. So me and my brother, who is himself progressive, we drove to 22 cities and interviewed dozens of people who support progressive causes. And I learned this. It's our feelings that divide us. Feelings driven by personality. Some of us want to be the innovators, the trusting, the idealists. Some of us want to be the managers, the cautious, the realists. And each of us builds a fortress around our feelings that you can't break through with facts and arguments. But maybe we shouldn't try. Apparently, evolution or God or whatever made us this way for a purpose. I think that purpose is that we need each other to get the full picture. I know it works that way with other things. But we have to talk to each other. If we don't talk to each other, we won't make progress. Well, in Northern California, we went to the East Bay to talk to Gregory Mengel, a PhD in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness who teaches classes for white people about white cultural conditioning, how it shapes our experiences, and how we can support change. These classes are offered through beyondseparation.net and untraining.org. A writer and teacher, his essays can be found at Huffington Post and on his personal blog, Cosmology of Whiteness. We asked him to tell us more about the classes he teaches.
So my teaching is mainly groups of white people looking at how racism shows up in progressive and liberal causes and movements and people's lives. The gist of these programs is really to help look at how deeply layered our conditioning is as white people, how racism shows up despite our best intentions, and how the system that we live under, which I'm going to bust out the word really early, white supremacy, because that's usually how academics and others refer to the institutionalized systems of racial injustice in the United States, how that costs white people, what that does to us individually and collectively, other than, give us certain, privileges. It really does take a toll.
Okay. What is it that you would like them to be able to either know or do or just understand when they're finished with the training?
Usually we as white people don't know who we are as white people. We don't know where we come from as white people. We don't know our history, how we became white people. What does that mean? That does mean something. I mean, we're conditioned to think that doesn't mean anything, that it's just a random happenstance of skin color that, people from Europe came over here in large numbers and we just call ourselves white because that's what we look like. But that's really not an accurate representation of the history of how race and racism were formed in this country. So for people to just understand that, the politics of this country is shaped by that, and oftentimes we are manipulated through our lack of understanding. It feels like common knowledge that racism played a big role in the election, and I think I'm not going out too far on a limb here to say that a lot of people were motivated to vote the way they voted based on anxiety around the previous 8 years and having a black president and an impression that somehow things were being taken away from white people and given to black people. And that is really the rhetoric that that our current president used to rile people up.
Okay, please hold that thought. Those same people that you're describing, some of whom voted primarily as a reaction to President Barack Obama, they voted for President Obama. In your mind, what do you think happened? Was it buyer's remorse? Were they just like, I shouldn't have voted for a black man? Or, I mean, what do you suppose?
That's a great question. The people who voted, so there's different groups of people who voted for different reasons, right? And I don't want to lump them all together. I don't want to say they all voted for him because they were attracted to his racist rhetoric. I think there is a real, genuine frustration in this country around the way things have been going. I feel that frustration, right? I was frustrated by the Obama presidency. I recognize that he represented a certain dominant, I want to call it neoliberal corporate order, right? For decades now, corporate power has been increasing in this country because of the way we do campaign finance, because of white supremacy. And there's a subtle and abstract connection between those two that I'm just glossing over. So there's this real frustration and there's a real genuine suffering, right, out in the country. And Barack Obama had a way of speaking to that suffering, right? He didn't necessarily do a lot of good for that, to alleviate that suffering, because of the degree to which he was accountable to big money and banks, etc. When people went to vote for Hillary Clinton, that's what they could see. Suddenly, that's all they could see. She was like accountable to these interests, right? That people now see as harmful. I feel like people overlooked that with Barack Obama. I feel like I often overlooked that with Barack Obama because of his personality, right? And because he could speak in terms that were inspiring and made us hopeful that he would be able to do something different. And she did not have that sort of charisma, and so...
So the corporatist kind of angle of this neoliberal, a lot more obvious with Hillary than with Obama.
Right. Okay. I mean, what's tragic is that what we got is 10 times worse along those same lines.
Well, I nod my head. I disagree, but I grant you that from your point of view, it is 10 times worse.
Yeah, okay.
And we'll come to that. I'd like to ask you about that.
From my point of view, our current president is serving corporate interests unapologetically and without constraint, handing the reins of our public institutions over to people whose interests are nakedly corporate.
You said something a little while ago about the obvious racism. And I do think it's fascinating that you see this as obvious racism. I watched The Same Man, and I didn't see obvious racism. Why do you think that is?
Well, I don't want to give you an answer that I don't know. I don't have a
But you generally think that I've misperceived.
Like when I hear him say that a Mexican judge can't give him a fair hearing because he's Mexican, I feel like it's hard to see that as anything else, especially given, like we can't take this stuff out of the context of this country's history of white supremacy, of treating white as a category of sort of neutral, where people don't have an agenda or a history or a point of view. They're just neutral, normal, regular folks. But then you add a category of like Mexican or black or Muslim. All of a sudden, that's who they are. They're no longer people who.
So you believe he's objectifying people? He's just kind of categorizing them, saying and making generalizations. The Mexican judge. I mean, there are counter arguments to that. My favorite is, of course, Justice Sotomayor talking about, how a wise Latino would judge differently than, I suppose a wise Caucasian. So, and I thought that's what, when I watched Trump, I was like, if we're going to be talking about, this taxonomy of race and culture in this society and how, wise Latinos can make different, so-called better judgments than wise Caucasians, then I think it's fair game for Trump to say, hey, this guy's, his whole lineage, he's 100% genetically Mexican and his parents were immigrants. So I think maybe he's going to be a little bit harder on me. I mean, is that not fair? Is that not a fair concern for somebody like Trump?
If that was an accurate representation of what Judge Sotomayor said or meant, I guess I would agree with you. But my understanding of what she said and meant was that we needed a diversity of life experiences on the bench, not just a group of people from a certain racial and social background, which is all pretty much upper middle class white people, mostly men. And so she's saying, here's an American experience that is not represented. And if we're going to look at the issues that are most pressing in the society that come to the Supreme Court, we need a diversity of viewpoints, right? So she's challenging the idea that white men are just plainly objective and they just see reality as it is. No, they see reality from the point of view of their racial, social, class, group membership. And she does as well. And she's just acknowledging that. She's not saying that she would be a better judge or have a better understanding of justice. And to say that somebody, because they're Mexican, cannot adjudicate a case fairly, like, what does that mean? Like, who can?
Well, that's a very good point. If I understand correctly, the point of educating, we whites in our inherent prejudices that we may not be aware of, the whole point of that is that we may, without knowing it, influence, some of our behavior in the workforce and whatnot, just, whether we lock the doors at, when we drive into a stoplight in a certain neighborhood. All of these things are things that we must acknowledge and must kind of react and be aware of. So, if we're going to say that that is a reality that we should all be aware of, I don't understand the point in calling foul when, when President Trump points out the obvious, which is, wow, this doesn't look good for me. I got a guy who's, his whole cultural background is with a culture that is right now maligning me about, calling Mexicans rapists and stuff like that. So, I got the point. I mean, he's an inelegant speaker. He could have gone about it, he could have kind of tiptoed along that, but he's not a guy that tiptoes. And he could have said it in a way that I suppose, social scientists and academics would have appreciated, maybe giving it better context. But he's not. He's a blunt instrument that, is threading a needle with a sledgehammer. And he says, hey, how am I going to get a fair case? And this guy's a Mexican. And again, he says a Mexican, just like I would say I'm an Italian and somebody's an Irish guy. I don't think he was impugning him. He was just saying he's a Mexican, right? I mean, we're both watching the same guy. I know you're sincere, and I would hope you think I'm sincere in this. I see a guy in his 70s who, if there were 5 people at a party and somebody says, hey, which one is, Jerome? And Jerome is the one black guy. Trump would be the guy that say he's the black guy. He wouldn't be the guy that says, oh, he's the guy with the, with the green vest on. He would say the obvious because he's just an old guy. That's the way he rolls. He's from New York. Anyway, inelegant perhaps, but racist? I don't see it. I'm sorry. But that's just one example. We could talk about different examples all day long. I guess my question is, I know Scott Adams, the creator of Dilbert, cartoon character, he describes that there is a confirmation bias that we all agree occurs. And he thinks we may be in the middle of a mass hysteria in which people, because of their confirmation bias, maybe my confirmation bias and your confirmation bias, we see 2 different men. We see Trump say, people are coming over the border, this, that, Mexicans, rapists, like that. And a lot of people conclude he's calling Mexicans rapists. I look at this and I say, oh, right, somebody's talking about this problem we have with rapists coming in from Mexico. We see 2 different things because of our confirmation bias. He thinks we're in this bubble of mass hysteria in which, we're not seeing, neither of us perhaps are seeing the reality, which is, here's a blunt New Yorker who's just not parsing language the same way our previous president did. Do you think that's a possibility?
I hear you, especially about, one of the things I study is cognitive science, and I like to look at the ways in which our brains shape our worldviews, right? Along with our history and our culture, and it's all mixed together. Just to return for a moment to the question of, is Trump racist? I'm actually not interested in that question. Is Trump the man? What is his internal biases or whatever? It is clear, though, that his use of certain kinds of stereotypes was reassuring to people who do have pretty strong, maybe not explicit, but at least implicit racial biases, right? Mm-hmm. Which we all have. We all have them, 99% of us,
sure.
But one thing I would say is that there's a pattern, right? So I would mention the Central Park Five, right? Who he took it's well known that he took a New York Times full-page ad out to call for their execution, right? Mm-hmm. And he's stuck to that even after they were found innocent. This country has a history of wrongly murdering black men because they've supposedly raped white women, right? Thousands of men were burned at the stake or hung from trees because they supposedly raped white women with very little evidence, right? So evidence and facts really matter. And patterns of racial stereotypes and racial injustice in this form really matter. And so returning to the question of rapists crossing the border, I don't think the statistics bear out that the people who are coming here without documentation are raping people at a higher rate than people who live here, right?
Perhaps. I think he was referring to the coyotes, the bad hombres, as he described them, the folks that are doing the raping, because
they're raping the undocumented, vulnerable people who are just trying to come here to get work. Sure, I didn't hear him talking about trying to protect those innocent people who are just seeking a better life. I feel like his supporters heard a blanket statement about these hordes of brown people coming across the border and threatening our innocent white women.
See, and that's where I think we see the confirmation bias at work. I watched that same video and I was like, I've read about this, how the coyotes are absolutely the worst offenders when it comes to how immigrants are treated. And why in the world our government has not cracked down on, on the employers that hire people, that draw a magnet, so that these poor people can go through? Oh yeah, agribusiness. Is that why would
yeah? I mean, you know that? Why? You do know why?
Oh yeah. It's just this big long.
So we're
treating them like lab rats.
I mean, we have a history of punishing the vulnerable rather than punishing the beneficiaries, the real beneficiaries.
I agree with 100%. Yes.
And what I heard him say was they're sending their worst.
Yeah. Yes.
Not people are coming for a better life and they're being taken advantage of by the people who are promising to get them here. I didn't hear any of that language.
And again, you heard that. What I heard was, hey, finally somebody's talking about the 40 families in Mexico who own 90% of the land, who tolerate all this and actually print up manuals telling people how to get out because they know, it's not the tall, thin, blonde-haired descendants of Cortez who are coming here. It's the mestizo Mexicans, the ones who are descendants of the Incans and the Mayans or whatever. And Mexico, such a racist society itself. The 40 families that dominate that country, with a wink, kind of with our agribusiness interests, kind of let all this happen. And that's what I heard when he said they're sending, is because there are efforts that Mexico makes to make it easier for people to come.
I hear what you're saying about who they are.
Yeah.
But again, my point was to highlight who they're sending, right? Which is not referring to the coyotes. It's referring to the people who are coming here because let me finish. Because they can't make a life for themselves there anymore. Why can't they make a life for themselves there anymore. Sure, we can blame the Mexican government, right? But we can't leave out, again, U.S. agribusiness, which has destroyed the Mexican corn market by dumping cheap corn grown here, right? So that people can't grow it and make. So there's this long history of countries in Latin America having their economies turned into export economies for U.S. consumption, having land being concentrated in the hands of very few, often with a very explicit aid of U.S. Forces, right? Like the overthrow of the president of Guatemala, of Argentina, of Chile, right? Usually because they were doing something like having structural reform along the lines of land ownership to return the land to the hands of the people, right? And the U.S. corporate interests who needed that land to grow bananas for a profit, couldn't abide by that. So they needed to get that leadership out of there and get a U.S. friendly dictator who would commit, who cares what kind of human rights abuses? That's the history of illegal immigration into this country, right?
And I agree with you 100%. I cannot believe our agribusiness has so compromised our morals in this issue. We're treating Mexicans horribly, absolutely horribly, and have since the Bracero program back in the 40s and 50s.
I'm so happy to hear you say that. I don't hear the Trump administration talking about that at all.
Yeah. Well,
I hear blaming them for coming here. Blaming them for coming here. They are illegal. They are breaking the law, right? I have people who support that point of view on my Facebook page. They're not articulating compassion for the struggles of those people. They're not coming here to get rich. They're coming here because they cannot survive if they don't come here. They're leaving their families. They're leaving their homes. They don't want to leave, right? They're not coming here to rape anybody. They're coming here because they have no choice. They feel like they have no choice. And we have a responsibility because we, the United States of America, created the conditions where they cannot survive in their own places of birth.
That's great to hear. That's a common theme I hear, and it's something that we don't appreciate enough. Our machinations over the last 40 years have created this debacle in Mexico. So it's kind of like everybody just turns their head and says, okay, it's kind of the fair thing to do. And I really can respect that. I think if you look, I've listened to Trump a lot. He has a lot of compassion, I believe, for Mexican people. He will describe what his solutions are in terms of economics. He's the one guy who will frog march, some agribusiness executive into jail for hiring illegals because he understands if they didn't have the magnet, all this human suffering would go away. I mean, everybody agrees. They need their George Washington. They need their revolution that will take the power out of the hands of the people who just kind of keep things down in Mexico. And I think Trump's 100% for that. I mean, I wish I could point chapter and verse to where he said it. I know that agribusiness folks are scared to death of him. They do not like the rumblings that Trump is coming up with. So again,
I completely appreciate that, though I feel like I have a responsibility to say this for whoever's watching this. I heard you use the term illegal as a noun. And as you, I'm sure know, those of us on my side of the political spectrum feel that is dehumanizing.
Oh, okay.
Did I
actually say illegals?
Huh? You did say illegals. Yeah. And, I understand that it's a handy shorthand, but the Associated Press is no longer using that term, and it is clearly dehumanizing whenever we just call people something that that de-emphasizes their humanity.
No, thanks for calling. Yeah, you should. Did you feel like you answered to your satisfaction my question about confirmation bias? My question was then, would you grant that there is a kind of a confirmation bias that may be going on both sides here?
I would totally grant that. I see it. I have my antenna up for it. It is possible to be rigorous around data, around evidence for points of view, right? Because it isn't, we don't live in a world where there's just a bunch of opinions that have no grounding.
Right, right. Okay, and you feel like if we were to dig, then you would have ample evidence to show a kind of a racism. And maybe, sending the dog whistles, I can understand people would think that that's what they're getting. And to me, that's the confirmation bias in action to me. To me, they don't sound like dog whistles. They just sound like a guy that's very plain spoken.
The whole point of a dog whistle is that it's working without you realizing it's working.
Yeah.
Right? I think it's well known in the literature now that the Willie Horton ad in 1988 was a dog whistle. Mm-hmm. The Willie Horton ad appealed to unconscious racist stereotypes, mm-hmm. right? So people were responding mm-hmm. through those racist stereotypes automatically without realizing what's happening, because that's how implicit bias works. So dog whistles trigger implicit bias responses, right? Mm-hmm. People don't know that it's happening is the point of a dog whistle. That's why it's called a dog whistle.
Okay.
Because you can't hear it.
Do you understand from my point of view how hard it is to defend against an accusation of dog whistles? I mean, Sonia Sotomayor can say, hey, because of my background and experience as a wise Latina, I can distinguish. But then I also, I'm a jurist. I can distinguish what's constitutional versus not. I can make these decisions. She's allowed to say that she doesn't fall for dog whistles because it's, in the end of the day, she's a jurist and she can use her intellect to get past all that. I don't think that's a courtesy that is extended to conservatives. I mean, maybe people are sending dog whistles, but we're not allowed to say, oh, yeah, sure. If Trump is sending dog whistles, if he's deliberately doing it, maybe he is doing it. Maybe he thinks there's this huge, Nazi electorate that nobody's been able to measure, right? Maybe he is sending racist dog whistles. But are we not allowed to say whether he's sending dog whistles or not? I don't use that to judge how I'm going to vote for something. I'm more going to judge based on my pocketbook than about the color of a guy's skin or who was the president for 8 years.
I am not going to extend that courtesy to anybody,
including
enough. Myself.
I see what you mean. I see what you mean. You're saying the fact that it happens at all kind of sullies the water.
Clinton was a huge Bill. Uh-huh. William Jefferson Clinton was a huge dog whistler.
Okay.
He got a huge amount of political mileage out of using terms like, what was the term that Hillary Clinton was being bludgeoned with during the election? Super predator.
Super predator.
Super predator. What's racial about that? Anybody can be a super predator, but we all knew that it was these young black men in the inner city who have lost their souls somehow because of, the culture of poverty or whatever.
This brings up a fascinating conundrum for me. What you described as dog whistles, to me, is sometimes applied to when I want to bring up an argument that involves culture. And by culture, I mean, for example, in certain cultures, we see a lot of unwed mothers. We see men abandoning women to have children. And in those arguments, I believe the statistics show that there's so much dysfunction that occurs, with certain behaviors that are coming in from certain cultures, that I think it's an argument that has to be had. That if we don't have that argument, what are we talking about if we're not talking about behavior? I think behavior has a tremendous impact on economic security. How can I have that argument without being accused of racial dog whistles?
Okay.
How do we talk about culture and the impact of behavior without being called racist? Frankly, it's something that it scares the dickens out of conservatives. They don't want to be tarred as a racist.
Yeah, that is a really interesting and great point. I think I could say a few things about it. One of the things I would say is we're very often having these conversations about people rather than with people.
Good point.
Right? So I feel like when you say culture, you mean inner city black culture, for example.
Yes, yes. Well,
because that's the stereotype of people having kids out of wedlock and men leaving their families.
Yeah.
I also want to point out that that's a stereotype.
Yeah, and I don't want to stereotype. That's why I was going to say that's what the statistics show.
I want to say the statistics don't completely bear that out.
Okay.
black fathers have a remarkable, from what I understand, a remarkable rate of staying with their children when they're not sucked into the criminal justice system, right? Because they've been channeled toward that since preschool, right? We have a school-to-prison pipeline in this country. We police inner-city schools with law enforcement officers, where we police suburban white schools with counselors, right? And so instead of getting detention and some extra attention, they get handcuffs and they get a criminal record. And so now when they get in trouble again in high school, like I got in trouble in high school, like maybe you got in trouble in high school, I have a criminal record from grade school, so I'm going to be treated harsher by the system. And it just mounts, right? And so here they are, we have a black man born today has a 1 in 3 chance of ending up in prison. We can say, oh, that's black culture, right? But where did that culture come from? I would argue, with credit to Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's made this very clear, none of these problems would exist as they exist without 400 years of white supremacy, right? These inner city black concentrated areas of poverty did not arise by accident. They arose through specific public policy that is well documented.
Are you by any chance referring to the Great Society programs, where we were subsidizing unwed motherhood? See, that's the natural comeback. I mean, my opinion is that the Great Society programs absolutely devastated the black family. You know, just like some of the things that the Indian Affairs Bureau did to Indians that devastated, you know, their culture, their economic security.
I'm not going to defend everything about the Great Society. I think it definitely had failings. I think it's exaggerated the degree to which it created, you know, like that it destroyed the black family by incentivizing unwed motherhood. There were some problems, for sure, right? The intent, which is to create a structural solution to the problems that were created by 250 years of slavery, 100 years of Jim Crow, a response to the migration of people escaping racial terror in the South by locking them in to inner city areas and excluding them from the new white suburbs where there was an opportunity to create intergenerational wealth through home ownership, right? Trapping them in these communities that were then over-policed. That created the conditions for mass incarceration and for the breakdown of families. Families often break down under really harsh economic conditions. That's not specific to race. When it happened to immigrant communities in the early 20th century, we responded with social work. We invented social work to deal with that problem. But we've responded to that problem in inner city black communities with more and more police, with law and order.
So it sounds like, in your opinion, we've set up a system in which people are practically guaranteed to fail, and then we blame them when they do fail. I mean, that's
a nice summary. That's a nice summary.
It's an oversimplification, I guess.
Yeah, and we continue to think, I mean, even the best well-intentioned liberals, how are we going to help those black people succeed in this system that was set up specifically so they would fail? So separate, create a hierarchy. However small the difference is, doesn't matter, right? Once you feel like you're better, and this goes back to human nature, once you feel like you're better, you are not gonna, if you're a well-intentioned person, you're gonna be, how can I help those people, right? Not how can I be like in a alignment and a coalition with these people, right? Because I realize we have a collective interest together. And so as long as I'm seeing it like it's a hierarchy and I'm helping, right? Which we still see, like that's liberalism, right? Let me help the less fortunate because it makes me feel good. And maybe it is it's driven by some kind of a moral commitment, which I don't want to denigrate that moral commitment. Sure. But it keeps a hierarchy of power in place, right?
Well, I'm absolutely fascinated because so many of the things you've described are things that is so insightful into some of the problems that conservatives have pointed out, which is when by saying so and so needs a hand up, aren't you really just kind of saying that they're not as good as us? I think it's fascinating that you're trying to address those issues as well as the structural issues that just come because of our history. So it sounds praiseworthy. I'd like to read more about it. Have you written anything about this? You write all the time, right? You're a blogger.
Not all the time.
Okay.
But I do have a blog with some, I think, educational things written on it.
And again, I'm just trying to understand where you're coming from. It sounds like what you're saying is that we have a structural racism that has embedded into our laws and into our society in general some things that are working against folks that aren't white.
I want to be clear that it's working against everybody.
Okay.
It's working against everybody.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it's something that kind of organically emerged as people were, as everyone agrees, as human nature. People who have a lot of resources tend to want to keep them. People who are in positions of authority want to remain in positions of authority, or if they've got a lock on a market, they want to remain in a lock on a market. Everybody understands that's human nature. You're saying that type of loosening of the reins of power has not really occurred yet. There are still forces at play that are trying to keep everyone pitted against each other simply because the status quo continues to allow corporate interests, or whatever you would want to call it, the folks in power to remain in power. That's kind of where you're coming from?
Yeah, and there's a couple of things I wanted to respond to. I try to remember what they were now. Mm-hmm. When we say human nature, supremacy or racism or othering is human nature, that's fine. We founded the society to counter that particular aspect of human nature. And we haven't found a way to do it, and we don't seem to be trying hard enough.
I agree with you entirely, yeah.
So that's one thing. And then I want to address this question about liberals and progressives and colorblindness and structure. So I belong to a group, a self-identified part of a movement of progressives. We'll call us racially aware progressives who find colorblindness to be deeply problematic. So colorblind liberals are not helping the cause, right? Because there is a certain class of colorblind liberal, and this is a little bit of a generalization, who believes that meritocracy is real, that people have more because they're smarter and worked harder, and there are some structural obstacles from the past. Slavery was real, and it created, it's partly to blame for the fact that there's inequity. So we should take some money from the rich, and we should give it to those people to help them get an education so they can be more like us. So we can all be like us, because we are in the ideal position of middle class, educated, regular folk, right? When regular folk is white, right? And had a certain experience of living in a country that was designed to give them benefits and keep them separate. So that colorblindness is really problematic because it doesn't recognize the ongoing obstacles that folks of color have. It doesn't recognize their own complicity, right? Because one of the ways it works is white people do things in their collective racial interest, like safeguard the quality of their schools tenaciously, right? And they think they're doing it in a colorblind way, but what they're doing, and let me just say we, just to include myself in that group. If I had children, I would probably be doing the same thing. Because what I'm doing is not advocating for segregation. What I'm doing is advocating for policies that make my child's experience better. And the result is segregation. The result is resources flowing to my school, my children's school, instead of other people's children's school. And I have political power by virtue of my whiteness in many different ways, right? In all given by history, but in terms of my access to people in power, in terms of how I'm seen by the institutions, in terms of when I speak, how what I say is heard. I believe that our society and polity can only function if there's a certain amount of structural equity in the system, right? Mm-hmm. So I believe that the inequitable wealth distribution in our society is toxic to the political process. Okay. It's toxic to having any kind of semblance of democracy. Okay. And so we need to address that, not because it's the nice thing to do, but because we want to have a functioning society.
Okay. It sounds then like you would be more in favor of a form of economics which would be more sharing the wealth, like socialism or communism or something like that. Is that what you would prefer?
Communism, I mean, these things are buzzwords now, right?
Yeah, whatever. But you would prefer more sharing of the wealth somehow.
I think that capitalism, as it is practiced right now, is killing us, right? The planet can't take it much longer, right? Let's just be clear. The statistics with regard to the disintegration of the systems of the planet that support life are unambiguously spiraling downward.
And I won't argue about that. I just want to double check though. To me, the conservative comeback to that always is, okay, at what point when you're sharing the wealth, does that give you a disincentive to keep creating value?
I don't think that people are incentivized to create value just based on financial return. I do all the work I do in the social justice realm with no financial remuneration. I'm doing it because it's fulfilling, right?
That's right. You still have a day job, right?
Right. I have a day job.
Yeah. Yeah.
I need a day job because I need to pay my rent.
Yeah.
But my passion doesn't really remunerate me so far.
Yeah.
So far. Okay. So that's not what I believe. Humans long to be creative and to build community and to support that community. You know? Okay.
I have one more question, and I can't not ask you this question because it's the big statistical outlier. The folks that are coming in from the West Indies, the Jamaicans, or guys coming from Nigeria and stuff, they come here and they say, oh, you African Americans are making too big a deal of it. Look at me, I'm doing great. And statistically, they are doing great. I'm sure there's good reasons for that. I've heard some of the reasons for that. But can you describe what is it about them that makes them such an outlier? And does that give you pause to think of, you know, I mean, you say there's structural racism, but here are folks that are doing well.
Well, first of all, I would always try to talk about group experiences rather than individual experiences. And so for group experiences, we look at statistics about how people are doing. I think that the group experience of suffering from 250 years of enslavement and 100 years of Jim Crow, and then systematic segregation in the North, right, for the whole 20th century and continuing, right, in some cases getting worse. We can't discount those things because some immigrants had a good experience, right?
That's a very good point. That's exactly what Reverend Jarrett Maupin said.
Good. I'm assuming he's really smart. So
he's the Black Lives Matter, prominent Black Lives Matter activist in Phoenix.
Well, I mean, I didn't make these things up. I listened to those people.
Well, what do you think of the state of the world?
I think the state of the world is an enormous crisis. We're having a crisis of meaning, especially in the modern West, right? I mean, you look at the epidemics of opiate addiction and suicide and just early death among, white men who I think, based on our conversation so far, in my view, are the people the system was meant to serve, right? And they're committing suicide and killing themselves in other ways at epidemic rates. So there's this crisis, there's this anguish, there's this suffering, there's this crisis of meaning, right? There's mass extinction of species, there's climate change, the oceans are dying, the oil's running out. And our leaders don't know what to do. It's not like there are leaders who have different ideas of how to solve this problem or these problems. Nobody knows what to do. So they're bickering about more trivial things.
Okay. If you don't mind, can I then challenge you then, if nobody knows what to do, right? And faced with the kind of debacles when people said or claimed they did know what to do, like, for example, the one I love to use is during the 40s through the 70s, we thought the solution to urban renewal and people who needed housing was to build these giant high-rises in the cities. And we all know what happened with that, how much horrible, human suffering was caused behind. Nobody defends them anymore. They're all being torn down, the projects, right? Given that we have these tremendously bad outcomes historically from some of these big projects, unintended consequences, I mean, we know now we're not going to be enslaving anybody. We're not going to be writing Jim Crow laws into our Constitution or into our laws. We know those things are bad. What's wrong with just backing off and saying, look, we're not going to do preference to anybody. We're truly going to have a colorblind society. Let's just let the market work out. We're not going to preference anybody over anybody else. We're just going to let the free market. Because we know what happens sometimes when people have big government solutions.
I completely hear you about big government solutions and the kind of hubris that goes into them. The idea that the market is neutral, I just have to reject that. The market is not neutral.
Money's neutral. I mean, ask Oprah.
No, I'm not going to ask any billionaire about whether money is neutral. I'm going to ask a poor person. So that brings me to my next point. All these giant solutions to these problems were pretty much come up with by people who look like us, right? Mm-hmm. I don't think the people whose houses they bulldozed in order to build these high rises and then relocate those people into them, they were not asked.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. The prominent opponents were mostly people who were in the neighborhoods. You're right.
So that brings me to my point. The leaders who don't know what to do, they need to ask the people who are impacted, right? They need to ask rural people in India what to do. They need to ask men in prison what to do, right? Because they can see where the system isn't working more clearly than people who look like us, and especially the people in power, right, can ever see. What they see is, how do I do this in a way that I don't lose the support of my corporate backers, right? So yeah, great. I just want to mention the name of Angela Glover Blackwell. She is a brilliant African-American public policy advocate who has this idea of the curb cut effect. That when we do things that benefit the most marginalized people, everybody benefits, right? So in the disability justice movement in the 60s and 70s in Berkeley, they said, we want curb cuts so that we can move around town in our wheelchairs, right? Have access to the outside like everybody else. Well, they did that, and guess what? Everybody fucking loves the curb cuts. Everybody loves the curb cuts. And she has a dozen examples of where we did something for some group that was heavily impacted and everybody benefited.
I see. Okay, right? Good. So the knee-jerk small government conservative reaction is often wrong.
I mean, I agree with small government conservatives that we should be cautious. Okay. But I don't agree that we should just talk to each other.
Okay, great. You also said Black Lives Matter is kind of misunderstood sometimes.
Yeah, and so here's where I want to say something risky, because it might sound like a critique. I want to be really clear that I'm not criticizing the movement or the slogan. I think the movement is the most important civil rights movement we've seen in decades. I think the slogan is super powerful and super clear. And I'm afraid that when some white people hear that phrase, what they hear is you don't think Black Lives Matter, so I need to tell you that Black Lives Matter. Translation, I think you're a racist. Right? And what that is level confusion. Because when I say Black Lives Matter, I'm not saying I don't think you think Black Lives Matter. I'm saying I don't think the institutions of this society function as if Black Lives Matter. That's what I'm saying. It's an institutional critique, not an interpersonal critique.
Good. Awesome. Thank you so much. That was Gregory Mengel in Oakland, California. And you'd have to go pretty far to find another person with a combination of idealism and frank talk, especially if he's willing to talk to somebody who disagrees with him. Thanks for listening, and please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thanks.